Tiberius was followed by Caligula, who was followed by Claudius, who was followed by Nero. And if you wanted to design a sequence of rulers specifically to illustrate every possible way that inherited autocracy can go wrong, you could not have done better than the Julio-Claudian dynasty in the 50 years after Augustus died. Tiberius started competently enough and ended as a paranoid recluse on the island of Capri, running the empire through letters while a man named Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, conducted a reign of terror in Rome on his behalf, eliminating real and imagined enemies until Tiberius finally turned on Sejanus himself and had him killed, along with his children and most of his associates, in a single day of choreographed violence that left the Senate simultaneously relieved and terrified. Caligula began his reign with such promise, generous, accessible, popular, that Romans who had survived Tiberius's paranoid final years greeted him with something close to euphoria. Within months, something changed. Whether it was illness, the intoxication of absolute power, a personality disorder that had always been there but needed the right conditions to flourish, or simple madness. Ancient sources are not reliable diagnosticians, and neither are we. The Caligula of the later years bore almost no relationship to the Caligula of the beginning. He humiliated senators. He executed people for entertainment. He reportedly made his horse a consul, which may be a slander invented by his enemies, or may be exactly what it sounds like. He was assassinated by officers of the Praetorian Guard after less than 4 years, and the guard found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor because the guard had learned something important in those 4 years. Emperors were made by soldiers, not by blood. Claudius was physically awkward, stammered, was considered by his family to be an embarrassment, and turned out to be one of the more capable administrators in Roman imperial history. He expanded the empire, adding Britain, which Caesar had visited twice and Augustus had wisely declined to conquer, as a proper province. He reformed the bureaucracy, created new administrative offices staffed by freedmen rather than senators, which the senators found deeply offensive, and which worked considerably better than the alternative. He was most likely poisoned by his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, who wanted the throne for her son by a previous marriage. That son was Nero. Nero's reign began well, as they all seemed to, and deteriorated according to the now familiar pattern of a young man discovering that nobody could stop him doing anything and making increasingly poor choices as a result. He had his mother murdered. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He persecuted Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, a fire he almost certainly didn't start, despite the legend, but whose reconstruction he oversaw with an enthusiasm that included building himself a palace of extraordinary size and extravagance called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, on land cleared by the fire in the center of the city. He fancied himself an artist, performed publicly as a singer and actor in ways that Romans found deeply undignified. And when the Senate finally declared him a public enemy and the legions began declaring for other candidates in 68 AD, he fled Rome and killed himself with the help of a servant, reportedly saying as he died that the world was losing a great artist. He was the last of the Julio-Claudians. The dynasty that Augustus had spent 40 years constructing died with a man weeping over his own mediocre talent in a suburban villa outside Rome. What followed was the year of the 4 emperors, 69 AD, when 4 different men held the title of emperor in the space of 12 months, each one elevated by a different army and destroyed by a different army, until a general named Vespasian, commanding the legions of the East, emerged with enough military backing to take Rome and hold it. He founded the Flavian dynasty, built the Colosseum which would seat 50,000 spectators and host gladiatorial games, animal hunts, and occasional naval battles for the next 4 centuries, and ran the empire with a blunt, practical efficiency that Romans found deeply refreshing after Nero. His son Titus succeeded him, reigned for 2 years, oversaw the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount in 70 AD during the suppression of the Jewish revolt, and died young and beloved. His younger brother Domitian succeeded him, reigned for 15 years with increasing autocracy and paranoia, and was assassinated by a conspiracy that included his own wife. And then, finally, something changed. The Senate, which had spent a century watching emperors emerge from dynasties and armies and palace coups, chose the next emperor themselves. They chose a man named Nerva, elderly, respected, a safe pair of hands, with no biological sons and no obvious successor. And Nerva did something that transformed the empire. He adopted one. He chose a Spanish-born general named Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan, as his son and heir. Not because of blood, because of ability. Trajan was the best available man for the job, and Nerva was wise enough or pragmatic enough or simply old enough not to care about dynastic considerations. Nerva died 18 months later. Trajan became emperor, and the empire entered what the 18th century historian Edward Gibbon would later call the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Trajan was everything the job required. He was a brilliant general who led from the front, eating the same food as his soldiers, sleeping in the same conditions, visiting the wounded personally after battles. He was an able administrator who maintained the machinery of the empire efficiently and without unnecessary cruelty. He was generous to the Roman people, expanding the grain dole, funding public works, establishing the alimenta, a welfare program for poor children in Italian towns that was funded by state loans to landowners. He was accessible to petitioners in a way that his predecessors had not always been. He also had an appetite for conquest that had not been seen in Rome since the Republic. He invaded Dacia, modern Romania, twice, in 101 and 105 AD, in campaigns of extraordinary scale and violence that ended with the destruction of the Dacian kingdom and the suicide of its king Decebalus, who was cornered by Roman cavalry and cut his own throat, rather than be captured. The conquest brought enormous quantities of Dacian gold and silver back to Rome, enough to fund a building program that transformed the center of the city. Trajan's column, which still stands in Rome, records the Dacian campaigns in a continuous spiral of carved relief sculpture that winds from base to top. 155 scenes, 2,500 figures, the entire story of the conquest told in stone with a documentary precision that archaeologists are still studying. Then Trajan looked east. He invaded the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates, in 114 AD, driving deep into Mesopotamia, taking the Parthian capital Ctesiphon, reaching the Persian Gulf. He stood on the shore and watched ships sailing toward India and said, according to Cassius Dio, that he would have followed them if he were younger. The empire reached its maximum extent under Trajan, more territory than Rome had ever held or would ever hold again. But territory and control are not the same thing. The newly conquered eastern provinces were restive, the supply lines impossibly extended, revolts breaking out among Jewish populations across the eastern Mediterranean in 115 AD, the Kitos War, in which the casualties on both sides reached numbers that ancient sources record in the hundreds of thousands. Trajan was already ill. He turned back west. He died in 117 AD in a small town in Cilicia, on the southern coast of modern Turkey, without ever reaching Rome again. His ashes were brought back and placed in the base of his column. The Senate voted him the title Optimus, the best. No emperor before or after received it. His successor was his ward and distant relative Publius Aelius Hadrianus, Hadrian, and the contrast between the two men was immediate and total. Where Trajan had expanded, Hadrian consolidated. He gave back Trajan's Mesopotamian conquests almost immediately, deciding they were indefensible, a decision that Roman traditionalists found humiliating and that was almost certainly correct. He spent the majority of his reign not in Rome but traveling the empire. 12 years of his 21-year reign spent on the road, visiting provinces, inspecting legions, commissioning buildings, personally overseeing the administration of territories that previous emperors had governed entirely through subordinates. He built walls, most famously in Britain, Hadrian's Wall stretching 73 miles from coast to coast across the north of England, marking the boundary between Roman Britain and the unconquered north. It was not, despite later legend, built primarily to keep the Scots out. It was a customs boundary, a military road, a statement of where Rome ended and the world began. It was garrisoned by auxiliary troops and studded with forts and mile castles and watchtowers, and it is still there, 2,000 years later, in better condition than most things built last century. Hadrian was the first emperor to wear a full beard, a Greek fashion reflecting his deep admiration for Greek culture, philosophy, and art. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, the great domed temple to all the gods, with its perfect concrete dome, its oculus open to the sky. Its mathematical proportions that still astonish engineers. In a form so well constructed that it has stood without significant structural alteration for 19 centuries and is still in use today. He built his villa at Tivoli outside Rome, a vast complex of palaces, libraries, theaters, baths, and gardens that reproduced in miniature the architectural wonders he had seen across the empire. A private world built by a man who had seen everything and wanted to keep it all. He also suppressed the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, the last and most serious Jewish revolt against Roman rule, with a totality that essentially ended the Jewish presence in the region for nearly 2 millennia. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina. Jews were forbidden from entering it on pain of death, and the province was renamed Syria Palestina, erasing the name Judea from Roman administrative vocabulary. The human cost was staggering. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands of dead, which, even allowing for ancient exaggeration, represents a catastrophe of enormous scale. Hadrian died in 138 AD, having arranged his succession with the same careful deliberateness that characterized everything he did. He adopted a man named Antoninus Pius, and required Antoninus to adopt in turn 2 young men, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, as his own heirs. He was building a succession pipeline, trying to guarantee stability 2 generations forward. It worked. Antoninus Pius reigned for 23 years, the longest reign since Augustus, in a period of such unbroken peace and competent administration that later historians struggle to find much to write about. No major wars, no major crises, the machinery of the empire running smoothly, the frontiers secure, the grain supply reliable, the finances in order. He was, in the opinion of those who had to deal with him, a genuinely decent man, patient, fair, reluctant to execute, careful with public money. The Romans gave him the title pious, the dutiful, the conscientious. It suited him. Then came Marcus Aurelius, and the Antonine dynasty reached its philosophical peak and its military crisis simultaneously. Marcus Aurelius had not wanted to be emperor. He had wanted to be a philosopher, specifically a Stoic philosopher in the tradition that taught that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances were beyond human control, and that the only rational response to a world of suffering and impermanence was to do one's duty with equanimity and without complaint. He had studied Stoic philosophy since childhood and continued studying it as emperor, writing his private reflections in a journal that he never intended for publication, in Greek, in camp after camp on the northern frontier, during the endless military campaigns that consumed most of his reign. Those reflections survive. They are known today as the Meditations, and they are one of the most extraordinary documents in human history, a head of state with absolute power writing to himself about the importance of humility, the certainty of death, the smallness of human ambition against the scale of time, the necessity of treating all people with justice and kindness regardless of their station. Passages that read as if the man writing them had genuinely internalized everything he wrote and was struggling every day to live up to it. His reign was not peaceful. The Parthians invaded the eastern provinces in 161 AD, the same year he took power, and the war that followed lasted 5 years and cost enormous resources before Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, adopted brother, and in every way his opposite, pleasure-loving and militarily ambitious, led Roman forces to a decisive victory. The returning soldiers brought something back from the east with them that nobody had asked for: a plague. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox, possibly measles, possibly a combination of pathogens that the Mediterranean world had never encountered before, swept through the empire from 165 AD onward, killing an estimated 5 million people over 15 years. It killed Lucius Verus in 169 AD. It swept through the legions, through the cities, through the countryside. Marcus Aurelius managed the crisis as best he could, but there was no managing a pandemic in the ancient world. You could organize grain distributions for the hungry and bury the dead as fast as they fell. And beyond that, you could only endure. While the plague weakened the interior, the frontiers buckled. Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, others, crossed the Danube in force in 166 AD, penetrating deeper into Roman territory than any barbarian force had managed in centuries, reaching as far as northern Italy. Marcus Aurelius spent most of the rest of his reign on the Danube frontier, fighting to push them back, living in military camps in conditions that would have broken most men, and that he documented in his journal with a weary, clear-eyed honesty that makes the Meditations read differently when you know the circumstances in which they were written. He died in 180 AD on the Danube frontier, almost certainly from the plague, at the age of 58. He had not adopted his successor. He had a biological son, Commodus. And whatever the wisdom of the adoptive succession system that had produced the 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius in the end did what every father does. He left what he had to his child. Commodus was 17 years old, healthy, physically beautiful, and catastrophically unsuited to power in ways that would not become fully apparent for several years. The Golden Age was over. The empire didn't know it yet, but the long, slow process that would eventually bring everything down had already, quietly, begun.